We're excited to tell you about the Pflugerville Community Church 50+ ministry. We call ourselves the PCC Health Nuts. We're a group of seniors caring for seniors by promoting healthy minds, bodies, and spirits. This is our 9th year and we're still going strong. All of our classes are free and directed towards seniors, but all ages are welcome. Membership at PCC is not a requirement to participate in any of our classes or events. Our primary goal is helping seniors stay fit and healthy. To accomplish this, we offer online and in-person fitness classes daily. Our classes for core strength and cardio are Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. On Tuesday and Thursday, we concentrate on breathing, balancing, and stretching. Although the exercises are designed for seniors, they will enhance your ability to stay healthy and active no matter your age. All of our exercises can be modified for our wheelchair or sedentary participants. Recently, we've also added line dancing. Line dancing not only keeps your body moving, it also keeps your mind sharp by learning and remembering the new dance moves. With the expansion of Zoom and YouTube, viewership is endless. Anyone with a computer, iPad, or a cell phone can participate. If computers are challenging for you, a member of our leadership team can help you get it all set up. Just ask. In addition to the exercise classes and line dancing, we have other classes and events. One of the most popular events is our healthy cooking segment. Once a month, a member of our group demonstrates healthy cooking techniques. We call these interesting sessions Wellness Wednesdays. In addition to cooking, we offer timely and informative topics that concern all seniors. Recent topics have included 31 Days to Better Health, area chiropractic services, and ancestry searches. We have several exciting topics scheduled that you won't want to miss. In addition, computer classes for seniors and senior game day at the church are starting soon. If you can't join us at the scheduled class times, you can always find us on YouTube PCC Health Nuts. Let me urge you to check us out. You'll get some great exercise, meet some fantastic people, and have fun along the way. Please contact our leader, Steve Morrison, at the church office, or send him an email at the address shown on your screen for additional information. May God bless you and your family. We hope to see you soon.
Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to our fourth day of the 6th annual Pflugerville Seniors Conference. My name is Rob Falbion, and I am the Director of Marketing and Communications for Age of Central Texas. We are a regional nonprofit organization that serves older adults and family caregivers with resources, education, and events just like the one today to help you on your journey. We are very proud to partner once again this year with the Pflugerville Community Church. You saw their video about their Health Nuts program. And we bring you this wonderful series of presentations each year in honor of Older Americans Month. And we are so glad that you're joining us today because we have got another fantastic presentation for you. Before we get started, want to go over some very quick housekeeping issues. Number one, we are recording this session. So if for any reason you get knocked off, your internet fails on you, don't worry. We're recording the session and we're going to be uploading it to YouTube so you'll be able to watch it later. Or if you would like to share it with family or friends, it'll be available to you as well. We also sent you a copy of the program for this year's conference. We hope that you take a look at that because not only does it have great information about our sponsors like Senior Resource Guide and CapTel, who is our presentation sponsor, and Medication and More, who provides great services here in Central Texas. It also has information about our speakers. And plus, we also sent you a lot of great resources in that program. So take a look at that. We're also going to send you a survey at the end of our series, and we hope that you'll take just a couple of minutes to fill that out for us. It'll be electronic, and it'll be very simple, and will literally only take you about 2 minutes. But it's information that'll be very helpful for us because we always want to improve these programs that we bring to you. But more importantly, we want to know what are some of the topics that are most important for you. we want to be able next year to bring expert speakers to address issues that you're dealing with in your journey. So be sure and tell us some of your ideas of topics that we can research for next year. And then finally, right down here on the bottom of your screen, you have a chat feature. It looks like a thought bubble like you'd see in the comic strips. Click on that, and we want you to communicate with us during today's presentation. Specifically, we want you to ask your questions because we have a fantastic expert on financial planning here today, and we want to make sure that we have a chance to answer your specific questions. So be sure and ask those questions during the presentation. When Darby is finished with her presentation today, then we are going to answer your questions. And we are going to stop at 11:30. We promised that we were going to be mindful of your time. So if for some reason we run out of time to answer all of the questions, don't worry. We are still going to answer your question. We will send you a direct reply and answer the question for you. So be sure and take advantage of this opportunity and ask those questions. All right. It is my pleasure to introduce Darby Armont. She is the Executive Vice President for Wealth Management and Business Strategy for Richard P. Slaughter Associates, which means that she is the lead for financial planning and client services for her team. And she specializes in solving complex situations for her clients, things like employee stock options and estate planning issues. She's a certified financial planner, and she is a chartered financial analyst chart holder. She graduated Phi Beta Kappa from the University of Texas, where she also got her MBA. She served on the board of directors for us here at Age of Central Texas. She's also a volunteer mentor at the Ann Richards School for Young Women Leaders and the past president of the Executive Women's Forum. Darby, we are so glad to have you with us today to help talk about what do we do with our financial health. We've been talking about all of our different types of health during this week. And so let's talk about our financial health and how do we plan for the future and how we can pass along all of the assets that we have. So Darby, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much, Rob. I appreciate the introduction. I appreciate the opportunity to talk with everyone today. And as Rob said, we'll have plenty of time for questions at the end. So let's go ahead and dive in. I'm going to share my screen here. Okay. All right, so we're going to focus today on legacy giving. And that is a very broad topic area. There's a lot of information that we're going to be going over today. So my main aim for you is not to necessarily understand every single concept that we go over today, but to really just pique your interest, make you start thinking about maybe doing a little bit further research into some of these areas. So our agenda today is, in terms of leaving a legacy, maintaining your wealth is, of course, a big part of leaving a legacy. We'll go into taxes just a little bit. I only have a few slides on it, but just a few important concepts to understand. Then we'll talk about the best ways to give to people and the best ways to give to charities. And then, of course, just a few moments on ensuring a smooth transition of your wealth. So as Rob mentioned, I'm Executive Vice President at Richard P. Slaughter Associates. Our website is slaughterinvest.com if you wanted some additional information. We do have a lot of articles that go into more in depth about many of these topics that we're talking about today. So that's a great resource for you to get a little bit more information. And just a quick note on my caregiving story. So I've lived in Austin for a number of years. I was one of those people that went to the University of Texas and never left. And about 7 or 8 years ago, my mom moved out here to be closer to me. And she and I went through a caregiving journey together. She had Parkinson's disease, and she was at a wonderful facility. But it really taught me a lot about what caregivers go through every day. And I was so grateful to find Age. As Rob mentioned, I served on the board of directors for 6 years. It's an absolutely amazing organization that can help in those times in your life where you're really trying to navigate difficulties that you've never had to face before. So thank you to AGE for all of your help and support during this journey. So of course, I can't go through a presentation without giving you all the caveats. I'm going to go over a lot of tax and estate information today, but everyone is different. So I encourage you to seek legal and tax advice from a qualified professional about your individual situation. This presentation provides general education, not advice. I'm not a CPA, nor am I a lawyer. I am a certified financial planner, however. And then also, since this presentation will be posted on YouTube, just an FYI, all the tax information we're talking about is really aimed at Texas residents, and it's also during the year of 2021. And so if you live in a state with a state income tax, for example, we don't have to worry about that here in Texas. Some of this information may apply differently to you. And then also, if you're watching this video after May of 2021, things may have changed. You know, Congress may have passed some new laws. Some things may be altered. So please keep that in mind if you're watching this at a later date. So let's talk for a moment about maintaining your wealth. And what I call this is put on your own oxygen mask first. Many of us have a lot of wonderful intentions of passing our wealth to our family members, loved ones, and possibly to charitable organizations. But let's just keep in mind that you need to make sure that your own needs are taken care of. So I'm going to be going over a few charts and graphs today. Don't worry about understanding every single thing. I'll just be pointing out some high-level numbers to keep in mind as I make my various points. So this is a chart that shows if you are 65 today, what is your probability of living to a specific age? Okay, so on the far left here, if you're a woman, that's the purple area. The probability, if you're 65 today, of living to age 75 is 86%. For men, it's 79%. And then what I want you to also really note here, for a couple, there's a 97% chance that at least one of you will live to age 75. Okay, well, if you're 65 today, you know, one of us will be around, and probably both of us will be around in 10 years. But one thing I want you guys to note is as we move out to age 85, there's a 75% chance at least one member of a couple will still be around. At age 90, it's 49%. So I talk to many clients who say, there's no way I'm living to age 90. Well, I mean, who knows about people's individual probabilities, but as a couple, there's a 49% chance one of you will live to age 90. So it's very important to be prepared for some of those expenses. The other thing I'll note here is a lot of people believe they're going to work longer than they actually work. So for example, for current workers, 71% of them expect to work to age 65 or older. But in reality, only 30% of people do. And that can be for a number of reasons, whether it's health or disability, whether it's because your company is downsized, or look at this, because of care for a spouse or family member. So one other thing to think about is the importance of saving while you're still working, because you may not be working as long as you expect. And then also these are probabilities of needing assistance with 2 or more activities of daily living. So this is going into a little bit of that long-term care or paid home care probabilities. So if you're a woman, you have a 33% chance of needing paid home care for assistance with 2 or more activities, and a 34% chance of being in a nursing home. Men are a little bit lower. And then if you're in some kind of care, it also can last for longer than you might think. Many people live in, say, a nursing home facility or assisted living for less than 2 years, but there's also quite a few that are over on the far end here that live for 8 years or more needing long-term care. So just be aware, it can be expensive. Here's a few numbers in the Austin area for nursing home care in a private room. Right now it's averaging about $7,000 per month. But I will note here, there are other options available, including home health care, adult daycare. Age runs an amazing adult daycare facility, and then also other assisted living facilities as well. So in terms of how do you pay for these expenses, I mean, the general goal is find as many resources as possible that will pay these expenses for you, okay? And I'll just very quickly go through a few resources. For example, if you retire earlier than 65, you have to pay for private health insurance. So the best bet is to try to stay on some kind of health insurance through an employer, through the military, maybe using the Affordable Care Act exchange. There's a lot of benefits for veterans, so make sure you're exploring those. There's many state and federal programs that can help with these expenses. And of course, there's some amazing organizations in this area that can help assist with these various resources, whether it's age, family elder care, and the rest on this list here. Other assistance that's available, there are financial planners like myself. There's also elder and estate planning attorneys, and I'll be encouraging you to potentially visit with those folks. There are care management companies that can help you navigate the maze of all of these different options. And there's even some companies that have very specific specializations in downsizing, for example, and they can provide some great support for that. And there are family mediators and facilitators out there that can help with some of the difficult conversations that you and your loved ones may need to have. But the whole point here is mainly to delay and reduce your own expenses, engage friends, family members, church contacts, use services such as an adult daycare center as opposed to a facility. That can save a lot of money. And then using home health care aids as necessary. And you may even be able to get Medicare to pay for part of that depending on the situation. Last couple of points about creating your own legacy so you can maintain it is a couple of really key decision points in your life, which is when to claim Social Security, and then also how to have a portfolio withdrawal strategy. So just a quick note on Social Security. I know this has a lot of numbers and colors on it, but most people have a full retirement age either at 66 if they were born in 1954 or earlier, and then they gradually moved it out to age 67 as their full retirement age. Many people, however, don't realize that if you take Social Security early, you have a permanent reduction in your benefits. If you were born in 1954 or earlier, you receive 75% of your benefits if you take them at age 62. And for those born 1960 or later, you only get 70% of your benefits if you claim at 62. On the flip side, if you delay your benefits to age 70, you could be at 132% or 124% of your benefits. So this is just a quick note that when you decide to claim Social Security can have a big impact on your future financial security. So this is not something that you necessarily automatically take right when you retire. There are some strategies that can be used here. And then in terms of your investments, keep in mind that anything that you're going to need in the short term, you're going to want to keep in very safe and liquid assets. Something that's a little bit more long-term can be a mix of stocks and bonds. And anything that's more long-term could be in a mix of more stocks compared to bonds, but everyone's risk tolerance is different and their situation is different. But the whole point here is that the more stocks you have, the riskier the portfolio is. And in any given year, you can have a much wider range of returns. This is for an all stock portfolio within a 1-year period. You can be anywhere from 47% up to 39% down. But if we take it out over a very long period of time, a 20-year rolling period, you can see that the dispersion of results is much smaller. So our point here is anything that you're going to need in the short term, you need to keep safe and liquid. Longer term, you can potentially take a little bit more risk according to your personal situation. And this is a note on portfolio withdrawals. So this runs from 1966 to 1995. And this is a 40-60 portfolio. And what that means is 40% of the account is in stocks and 60% is in bonds or fixed income. So the assumed rate of return was about 8% per year. And this person decided to take about 5.2% of the account out each year. So if you assume the straight line return of 8% per year, you would have projected that you would have over 1.2 million available in the account at age 95. Great, everything looks perfect. But the actual rate of return ended up being about 9.1%. So the actual rate of return was better than the expected, yet this person ran out of money. The account went to zero by age 90. And that's because there are variable returns in investments. You can see year by year, while you have a long-term average on this purple line, in any given year, the market can be significantly higher or lower. So one point here is if you are able to dynamically adjust your withdrawal rate according to what the market is doing, and it's not necessarily a big change from year to year, but if you're able to take a little bit less out when the market's down a little bit, maybe you take a little more out when the market is up, you're able to push that withdrawal rate down or the depletion rate out to age 95 as opposed to age 90. Okay. All right, so, and one thing I'll note here is people's household spending naturally declines over time. So on that previous slide, when we talked about reducing your withdrawal rates according to what the market is doing, really one thing to keep in mind is they may naturally go down, your expenses. So the height of your expenses is generally around age 45. And even though healthcare does take up more of your overall expenses, that's this purple area here, it actually overall declines as you age, which can help with portfolio withdrawal rates. Okay, so that was just a quick note about the importance of maintaining and building your own legacy. Let's talk a little bit about how to give money most effectively to loved ones and charities. And we're going to start with the very, very short federal tax lesson here. So there's different types of taxes that we'll be talking about. There's income tax, and most people end up paying income tax on all or part of their income. Then there's a gift tax on wealth transfers that happen during your lifetime, and estate tax on wealth transfers that happen at death. But one note here for gift and estate tax is that they typically only affect people that have assets of more than $11.7 million. So for the rest of this presentation, I'm generally going to assume that most people, because it's true, most people do not have more than $11.7 million per person. So just a quick note on the difference between income, gift, and estate tax. Gift and estate tax typically does not affect many people. And I wanted to cover just a couple of misconceptions about taxes. And I like to call this, it's probably not as bad as what you're thinking. The first thing is people talk a lot about tax brackets and they worry about, okay, if my income goes up, that's going to bump me into the next tax bracket. But I want you to realize that there are actually buckets at different tax rates. And everyone, regardless of whether you make $30,000 in a year, $130,000 or $1 million in a year, everyone fills up the same buckets. So your first $9,950 for single filers is at a tax rate of 10%. The next bucket is at a tax rate of 12%, and then it goes on up and above that. So the misconception I often run into is people say, well, I don't want to incur more income because I don't want to be bumped up to the next bracket. In reality, only that next dollar would be taxed at that next bracket. You've still been able to fill up all those buckets that happened before that. So that's why you talk about your marginal rate. That's what this tax rate is over here. but your effective rate is much lower. Okay, so that's one thing to keep in mind. If you're thinking I'm in a 24% bracket, it doesn't mean all of your income is being taxed at 24%. As I mentioned before, the vast majority of people do not pay gift or estate tax. They may pay income tax on the types of things that they inherit, for example, but they mostly do not pay estate or gift tax, which is a nice surprise to some people. They assume when they receive an inheritance, for example, that they have to pay income tax on the inheritance, and that's generally not the case. The other question I'm getting a lot right now is there's a lot of proposals out there about some potential tax changes. Most people, however, will not be affected if they're making less than $400,000 a year. There's always some exceptions to that, but for the most part, at the moment, from what's been proposed, it could always change. Most people will not be affected by any of these proposed changes if you make less than $400,000 a year. I do have a little bad news. Sorry, Social Security benefits are probably going to be mostly or at least partly taxable. So that's the other thing I sometimes hear is, well, I paid all this money into the Social Security system, it should be tax-free. Sorry, it's not. You do get taxed on Social Security. Okay, so let's start talking about wise ways to give to people. Okay. So you often may hear of something called an annual gift limit of $15,000 per year per person. Okay. One thing to understand, however, is that there's really not an effective limit of how much you can give away per person per year. If you give more than that to someone, it's reportable because the IRS wants to know, okay, have you given away a bunch of money during your lifetime that might be then subject to the estate tax or the gift tax. So anything above $15,000 per person is reportable, but most likely it's not going to be taxable. Okay, so just be aware when you hear people say limit of 15,000, it's not necessarily an actual limit that's going to affect you personally or the person who receives the money. So for anyone else, if you're giving a grandchild $5,000, as a graduation gift, or you're giving friends and family members, other small gifts, it's generally not going to be reportable or taxable. And by the way, your spouse can also give $15,000 per person per year. So for you as a couple, you could give someone up to $30,000 per year, and it would not be reportable. Also, one note on gifting, there are some exemptions to this $15,000 reportable limit. You can give unlimited amounts to your spouse, by the way. You can give to charities. You can give money directly to educational or medical providers, and that does not count as a gift either. So if you wanted to directly pay college tuition for your child or grandchild, that is not a gift. And it also is the same deal for political organizations. So these direct gifts, it can be cash. You can write someone a check. You can give them stock. Let's say you had invested in Disney stock many years ago. You could give them actual stock shares. You can give them real estate and many other different types of assets. And the note here is that the recipient of your gift gets your cost basis. Okay, so what's cost basis? So when you buy an asset, like say a stock, let's say you paid $10 a share for that stock. That's your cost basis. Then you turn around and you sell it for $15 per share. The government says, okay, that is $5 of capital gains, and we're going to tax you on it. Okay, so you bought it at 10, it appreciated $5 to 15, and then you sold it. Okay, so if you gave those shares to someone else, they would inherit that $10 per share cost basis. Okay, so we're going to get back to why that's important here in just a couple of moments. But one thing to think about is if you have stocks, for example, that have gone up a lot in value, and let's say you're in a relatively high tax situation, instead of you selling that stock and paying the capital gains tax on it and then giving someone else that money, you could gift them the shares. And then if they're in a lower tax bracket, if they sell those shares, they may pay less in taxes. So that's one thing you can do with appreciated property. Now, at your death, you can also give cash to people. You can give stock, real estate, other types of assets. And one note here is that the recipient gets that cost basis stepped up to market value as of your date of death. Okay. Now, by the way, this is something that is under consideration that may change in the future, but this is how it's been for many, many years. So let's take that same Disney stock, for example. So you had paid $10 per share, it appreciated to 15. Well, when that person inherits that stock from you, their new cost basis is $15 per share. That's what it means to be stepped up to the market value. So if they were to sell it, they would not owe any taxes. Now, of course, if it appreciated after they inherited it, that would be taxable. But that's one thing to keep in mind, is that if you're thinking about giving away certain stocks or selling certain stocks to fund your lifetime expenses, it's going to be more beneficial for your heirs if they inherit highly appreciated stocks. So for you, you may want to sell stocks that have a loss on them or that don't have much of a gain, and then leave those highly appreciated stocks to people in your will or your trust so that they get stepped up at your death. Okay, so there's different ways we can give to people, and most people just give money directly to someone else. Okay, so they literally write a check to someone, and now that money is in that person's name. It's one of their own assets. But be aware there's issues with this depending on the situation. So if the recipient is on some kind of need-based aid, whether from the government or from college, having additional assets could affect these benefits. Okay, so you most likely would not want to directly give someone a check who is on some kind of need-based government aid, like SSI. Or if they're trying to pay for college, if you give your grandchild a large check for graduation, that actually can mess up some of their need-based aid. So you want to think about that before you make a direct gift to someone. Also, if that recipient is sued, then these assets are considered his or hers typically, and may be subject to creditors' claims. Now, big note here, when you get divorced, that's a suit. That's being sued by someone for divorce. Now, there are special rules in place if you are gifted money or you inherit money during your marriage. There are ways to protect that in the event of a divorce. But most people don't go through the steps necessary to do that. So they end up commingling it with their spouse's assets. And then years later, when they get divorced, the spouse says, well, all of that is really commingled together, so I want half of everything, even if some of it came from a gift or an inheritance. So that's something to keep mindful of. Also, when you give money to someone, they can just spend it. That is their money. They don't have any obligation to follow any rules, do anything other than, as long as they're over 18, they can pretty much do whatever they want to with it. Okay. And they may be involved with someone you don't necessarily like, or they may be married to someone you don't necessarily like. So just be aware that once you give that money to them, it's theirs to do with whatever they want, regardless of what your wishes are. Also, those gifts do go into their estate. Not generally a big deal. As I said, most people are not subject to the estate tax, but just be aware that that could cause problems down the road. For example, if they lowered the threshold for the estate tax. Also be aware if you leave an IRA to a non-spouse beneficiary. So let's say your spouse had passed away, and so you updated the beneficiaries on your IRA to your children. There are some new rules in place. So if someone inherits an IRA, whether it's a traditional IRA or a Roth IRA, the account must be distributed within 10 years of receipt. And again, this is for non-spouses. If you're a spouse, you're generally fine. But for non-spouses, that means, say, for example, if your child is in their 40s, 50s, or 60s when they inherit an IRA, they may be at their highest tax years because they may be at the height of their own careers and earning power. then they inherit an IRA, especially if it's a traditional IRA, they're going to have some income that they're going to have to recognize over this fairly short 10-year period. It used to be stretched over their lifetime. So just be aware of that. We'll come back to some things you can do to help mitigate this. So one option is, instead of leaving money directly to people, you can make that gift to a trust, okay? And there are a ton of different options with trusts. I'm not going to try to go into all of them. An estate planning attorney would really be the best resource to see what's most appropriate for your personal situation. But I wanted to give you a little bit of education about trust, because you hear that word thrown around a lot. And unfortunately, people use the word trust to mean many different things in different contexts. One quick note I'll make is that there is something called a revocable or irrevocable trust. Some people say revocable or irrevocable. That's what I say because we're in Texas. But the revocable trust, that's like a living trust. Okay, so we're not going to talk about that. A living trust is something where you can put money in and take back money back out anytime. We're not going to be covering that today. But for an irrevocable trust, that's when you put money in, you can't take it back out. It's a gift that you've given to this trust for the benefit of someone else, but it does have certain advantages to it. So the main thing about trust is that it allows you to write the rules around the use of the money after you're either gone or it's otherwise not in your control if you've done this during your lifetime. So remember when I was talking about giving money to your grandchild? Well, she may not use that money to go to college. She may take that gift and go on a vacation with her boyfriend or something like that. So with a trust, however, if you left it in trust for her, there would be some controls in place where you could say when it's okay and when it's not okay for her to use the money in that trust. So you can make lifetime gifting with this type of trust, an irrevocable trust. You don't have to wait until after you pass away. You can form a trust now and make gifts to it. And then you can also leave money to this trust in your will. You can also set up something called a special needs trust. Remember I talked about that you could end up, if you gave assets, say, to a disabled person who's on need-based aid, that could mess up their aid. Special needs trusts are one of the tools that we'll be talking about to help prevent that. They can actually receive some benefits and have it not affect their need-based aid. And then you can also create a trust in your will. It's called a testamentary trust. Okay, so you can either create a trust now during your lifetime, or it could be created in your will so it actually doesn't come into play until after you pass away. So using trusts, there's some pros and cons to everything, of course. The pros are you can control to some extent, a great extent, how the money is spent. It can provide protection against creditors, including divorcing spouses. And it's not in the beneficiary's estate. And again, there's a lot of different flavors of trust, and it's really going to depend on your individual situation. These are high-level rules, however. The cons, though, they are expensive to set up, especially those lifetime trusts I was talking about. It's not as expensive to set up a trust within your will as part of the standard estate planning package. There are also generally annual reporting requirements, including filing tax returns. So that's an additional expense. They generally have higher effective income tax rates. And again, depending on the type of trust it is, they pay those same brackets. They have the same buckets that they fill up, but they just hit the higher brackets. It's at much lower dollar amounts, which raises their effective tax rate. You also have to find a trustee. So a trustee of the trust is the person who generally controls the assets in there. And you need to find someone who's going to fit the beneficiary's needs. And then also find one who's going to charge a reasonable fee. A lot of trustees charge pretty high fees. So that's something you want to keep an eye on. And also with a trust, it could lead to resentment from the beneficiary of why you decided to tie up their money in a trust instead of giving it directly to them. So it's something that does require some good communication to make sure that the beneficiary understands and appreciates the value of the trust. You can also use 529 plans to make gifts. So these are college savings accounts, and they can be used, of course, for college, graduate school, but also for private school. That's something that changed in the last few years. You can use 529s for private school tuition when you're in elementary or high school. 529s are sponsored by states, and they're either set up as a prepaid tuition plan, or the one that most people are familiar with is more like an investment account. Okay, so you put money in, and it looks sort of like a 401k. It could have either static investments, like an aggressive mix of investments, or ones that are more age-based, so they become more conservative over time as the child approaches 18. It's important to make sure you analyze investment fees and performance, and also take a look at administrative fees. Savingforcollege.com is a great resource for 529s. There's also, if you live in a state that does have a state income tax, there could be some advantages of using your own state's plan as opposed to a different state. But in Texas, where we don't have a state income tax, it doesn't really matter what state you use. So you don't have to use the state of Texas's 529 plan. The pros is it can be tax-free if used for qualified educational expenses. You can also front load them with multiple years of that $15,000 gift that I was talking about earlier. And the big thing is you can change the beneficiary to another qualified family member. So for example, if one child decided not to go to college, you can actually change a beneficiary to another child who does, for example. The cons is that there could be taxes and possible penalties on the earnings if the proceeds are not used for college or private school. Having a 529 could affect qualification for need-based financial aid. And there are limited investment options. Like I said, sort of like a 401k lineup. But they are great, great tools to use for paying for college. There's also something called ABLE accounts. This is designed for beneficiaries with disabilities, and they're styled after 529 accounts, so there's a lot of similarities. It also helps you avoid setting up a special needs trust. Special needs trusts, like other lifetime trusts, can be kind of expensive to set up and maintain. But ABLE accounts allow that tax-free growth on assets if it's used for qualified disability expenses, and generally does not disqualify the beneficiary for need-based government aid. But you kind of have to watch a couple of things on there, including the total account balance. It may affect SSI benefits. So definitely encourage you to speak with an estate attorney before you set up an ABLE account for a beneficiary who's on need-based government aid. The beneficiary's disability must have begun prior to age 26. And in this case, there is an actual $15,000 annual contribution limit. So in this case, it is a hard dollar amount of how much you can put in per year. But if the beneficiary is working, for example, my uncle has been disabled his entire life, but he's been able to work for many years, you can actually maybe be able to put more into an ABLE account. Another great way to gift to people is funding a Roth IRA. So a lot of times your child or your grandchild may be eligible for a Roth IRA. I'll talk about that in just a moment. Roth IRAs are incredibly powerful savings tools for people. They do grow tax-free as long as they're held for at least 5 years and are used for qualified expenses. And that those qualified expenses do include distributions after age 59 and a half. So there could be some ways you could get money out of a Roth before that, but really they're intended to be retirement savings vehicles. Just be aware that the contributor, so that's the person, say if you were funding their Roth account, they must have earned income from a job. Okay, so it can even be an internship or babysitting or something like that for a younger person, but they must have earned income in order to make a Roth IRA contribution. The maximum is $6,000. If the contributor is 50 or more, they can do an additional $1,000, and that's per year. And there are some family income limitations, so just be aware of that. Okay. And compared to a taxable investment, so with a taxable investment, if you put in the same amount per year for 30 years, because you have to pay taxes on those income and other earnings on the account every year, you can see here the accumulation of the account for a taxable account is much less than what it is for a Roth IRA. So there are just some fantastic benefits to a Roth. And so this would be a great way to really help someone's financial future, is to fund their annual Roth IRA contribution if they're eligible. And honestly, one of the biggest gifts you can do is give the gift of knowledge to people. We work a lot with 401k participants. And so I meet with a lot of people who are, say, in their 20s or 30s. Many, many times they tell me how their parent or their grandparent sat down with them and said, it's important to save to your 401k. You need to start from day one, and they help them figure out how to invest the account. So they do listen. It doesn't seem like they always do, but they do listen to you. And to have someone sit down with a child or grandchild and really talk about the importance of saving and investing can make a huge difference in their lives. Make sure they understand they can't just rely on Social Security. A lot of young people think, well, I'll have Social Security when I get older. Well, as many of you may have already realized, Social Security is not enough. Okay, so let's talk about a few great ways to give to charities. And we're going to go back to Federal Taxes 101 and talk a little bit about what it means to itemize versus taking a standard deduction. So everyone gets the ability to take a standard deduction on their taxes. For 2021 is $12,550 for singles, $25,100 for married filing jointly. And then if you're over 65, you do get some additional standard deductions. Why is that important? Because if you take your total income minus your deductions, that equals your taxable income. So the taxable income is where you start filling up those buckets that we were talking about earlier. That's a very simplified way of thinking about it, but it's a useful way to think. Okay, I have gross income, I have my deductions off of it, that equals my taxable income. So the bigger that deduction is, the smaller your taxable income is. Now, if you have more deductions than these standard deductions, you get to itemize on your taxes. And all that basically means is you get to list out all of your individual deductions. And if they exceed that standard deduction, then you're going to pay less taxes. Okay. So some of these may be what you've heard of as the SALT, which is state and local taxes. For most people in Texas, that's generally going to be your property taxes that you pay on your residence. That's a big expense for us here in Texas. It can also be sales taxes in there as well. But that deduction was capped a few years ago at $10,000. Okay, so just be aware of that. Also, mortgage interest is deductible. Unreimbursed medical expenses if it's over 10% of your adjusted gross income, and charitable contributions. Okay, so let's keep that in mind. So if all of those, and there's some other ones out there, but really these are the main ones. If all of those exceed your standard deduction, then you end up making your taxable income a little bit lower. And we'll be talking about why that's important. Okay. One thing here is I wanted to point out is something called the bunching strategy. That's not a technical word. That's something that's just a useful way of thinking about it. But let's say, for example, you were pretty close to, once you added up all your individual deductions, you were pretty close to the standard deduction, but you weren't close enough to itemize in any given year. There is something you can do where you can double up on your property taxes and charitable contributions every other year. Okay, so let's say in 1 year you decide to pay your property taxes in January and in December, and you made a large charitable contribution that year. That may be enough to push you above that standard deduction level. And then in the next year, you just take the standard deduction. The following year, you double up. Okay, so that way you can take advantage of the extra property taxes and charitable contributions that you're making. it used to be a fantastic strategy before they capped the state and local taxes at the $10,000 per year, especially in Texas. A lot of people pay more than that in property taxes each year. So it's not quite as great, but it can still be a really powerful way to take advantage of both itemizing and then taking the standard deduction. There's also something called a donor advised fund, and that's basically an investment account for a charity. It is irrevocable, so keep in mind, once you put money in, you can't take money back out. But you can donate cash, securities, or other assets. And the great thing about it is the tax deduction you receive in the year of the deduction, of the year of the gift rather, is equivalent to the fair market value at the time of donation. Okay? So that money goes into the donor advised fund, and then you can grant money out of that donor advised fund to qualified charities. And that can be done on your own schedule. So remember our strategy of bunching your charitable contributions into every other year. Well, that could be difficult for a charity who's used to getting regular contributions from you. That could be difficult for their budget. What you could do though, is you could bunch your contributions, put them into a donor advised fund, and then when you grant to charities, you can keep those on a regular schedule each year. And that can help smooth out budgets for charities. It's best to donate long-term appreciated stocks. So remember our Disney example where you paid $10 a share, it's now worth 15. If you were to donate those shares of Disney into the donor advised fund, the tax deduction you get is equivalent to $15 per share. Okay, so if you have a loss on a stock, you want to sell it and take the loss on your own tax return. If you have an appreciated stock, it might be a good candidate for a donor advised fund. Okay, that way you can avoid paying the capital gains taxes by, say, if you sold those Disney shares and then donated the money. Why do that when you can just donate the actual shares and get the full value as the deduction? The donor advised fund does grow tax-free, so you can either turn around and grant the money out of it immediately, or you can keep it in there and it can grow over time. And just one quick note here, this is great for assets where you have no idea what this is. So let's say you inherited ExxonMobil stock from your mom in 1986. I have no idea what the cost basis is. If you donate those shares, your deduction is that fair market value, and you never have to worry about going through and digging up paperwork on that. There are also something called community foundations to a donor advised fund. They tend to have a greater local focus, and they may have some other options for you to give, like say scholarship funds or maybe some simplified foundations. Austin Community Foundation is a great organization. There's also one in Williamson County. So just be aware there's some great ones around the area, and they're wonderful resources just to go to their website and learn a bit more about how community foundations work. There's also something called a qualified charitable distribution. Okay, and this is from an IRA. Okay, so what we were just talking about with donor advised funds, those were from taxable accounts where you held stocks. Now in an IRA, you may also hold stocks, but there's different rules about taking money out of an IRA. So you may have heard something that used to be called an IRA charitable rollover. That's the same thing as a qualified charitable distribution, or QCD. So if you're over 70 and a half, you can make contributions to charities directly from your IRA. And the really nice thing is it does not count as income for you, nor do you take the deduction on it. So let's say, for example, you're thinking, there's no way I'm ever going to be able to itemize on my taxes. You know, all I can do is, take the standard deduction each year. The great thing about this is that you don't have to worry about whether you're itemizing or taking the standard deduction, because it does not count as income, nor do you have to worry about the deduction. So QCDs are a fantastic tool. And if once you're over age 72, where you're having to take required minimum distributions from traditional IRAs, these QCDs can count towards that annual requirement. QCDs are, you can do up to $100,000 per year. It must come directly from the IRA to the charity, so you can have your custodian cut a check, or you can write a check from a checkbook, but just keep in mind, don't have that money paid to you and then you make the donation. It needs to come from the IRA. And it's better to use traditional IRAs, not Roth IRAs. So you can also name a charity as a beneficiary in your estate planning documents, whether it's a direct beneficiary on a retirement plan or someone named in a will. One thing to keep in mind is if you have, say, a traditional IRA and a Roth IRA, generally speaking, it's better to leave that traditional IRA to a charity because the charity doesn't pay tax on it, which is great. And then for a person, you could leave the Roth IRA because that's already tax-free. These can also be good choices for HSAs or health savings accounts. And the reason why I say that is health savings accounts. These are special accounts you can set up if you have a high deductible health plan. They're wonderful during your lifetime, but they're really not great to leave to non-spouse beneficiaries because that beneficiary has to take all of that money out within a year and get taxed on it. So spend down those HSAs during your lifetime and your spouse's lifetime, and then leave that remainder to charity. That could be one good strategy. So high level, better for people is to leave Roth IRAs, taxable accounts, and life insurance policies. Better for charities, traditional IRAs, and health savings accounts. And I just have a couple more slides here, and then we'll open it up for questions. And this is about ensuring a smooth transition of wealth. And so one thing to keep in mind is part of leaving a legacy is, trying to maintain that even, of course, throughout your lifetime, but then also after your passing. So I know we had a great session on Tuesday about legal documents. So the important thing is to make sure that you get your documents in order. And the perspective I'm coming from is that you want to make it as smooth and easy as possible and avoid as many conflict as possible after you're gone. So I encourage you to visit with an estate planning attorney, make sure all of your documents are updated and that they truly reflect your wishes. Be aware that you want to double check your beneficiaries that you've named on life insurance policies and retirement plans, because those bypass your will. Okay, so it's really important to make sure you double check all of that information. And then make sure that the documents are accessible by the people who will need them, say your power of attorney or even your executor after your passing, because the last thing you need is people having to pay lawyers or having to go to court or having to drill into safe deposit boxes. Those are just unnecessary expenses. And then also make sure that you're talking to your beneficiaries. Make your wishes clear to everyone, especially if there may be some kind of conflict in the family. This is where those family mediators could come into play, be a big help to you. You could have that in a family meeting, but at a minimum, you could leave a letter to your beneficiaries with your other estate documents, especially, for example, if you had made the decision to, instead of leaving your estate equally to 2 children, maybe you leave more to one person who might need it more compared to the other. Having something in place to explain your intentions could really go a long way to reducing conflict, even potential lawsuits or the loss of a relationship, which I'm sure is the last thing you would want. So high level, make sure your wealth passes to the people and the causes that you care about, not to attorneys who are going to fight it out. Okay, so that's the end of my content here. We can go ahead and turn it back over to you, Rob, to talk about some questions that may have come in during the session today. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen so you can see us a little bit better.
Great. Thank you so much, Darby. That's just so much incredible information. I know it's a lot to unpack and to think through, but we do have some questions about things that you have been discussing. A couple questions about donor advised funds. Number one, the question is, does it accumulate interest? I think you kind of mentioned that it does, but how do they kind of work? As opposed to, say, if I put this into a savings account and it accrues interest, how is it how is it special?
Okay, that's a great question. So a company like Schwab or Fidelity, for example, is going to sponsor this donor advised fund. So they've actually created a public charity. So when you donate your appreciated securities or your cash into a donor advised fund, you can choose how it's invested. Okay, so for example, it can go into a money market account that could accrue a little bit of interest. So it's not going to grow, but it's also not going to go up and down with the market. So that's going to be your best bet if you're planning on granting those donations back out of the donor advised fund to your charities in a pretty quick order. And that's what a lot of people do. They put money in, they turn around and they grant it back out. So you don't want to have any exposure to market volatility or fluctuation. Now, that being said, there's typically going to be other options available to invest those contributions that you've put in there. So kind of like when you have a 401k, you could have a low risk option, you could have kind of a balanced option or an aggressive option. A lot of donor advised funds have those same things. So what you could do if you're trying to build a bigger account, a bigger legacy, so you weren't going to grant out of that account every year, maybe you put that in something that has more stocks in it that's going to grow for the long term. And then later on down the road, 5, 10, 15, 20 years later, you've amassed a pretty nice balance in there. You can then make a more significant gift to a nonprofit.
And another question specifically about the donor advised fund, can money from a taxable mutual fund be moved into a donor advised fund?
Yes, great question. So I was talking about Disney stock as our example, but you can donate shares of a mutual fund from a taxable account. You can donate an exchange traded fund, anything that can be held in a regular brokerage account, or even other things like real estate can be put into a donor advised fund. Excellent.
Got a couple questions about CRT charitable trusts. I went and looked this up while you were speaking about what is a CRT. So can you very briefly talk about that? It is, from what I read, it's irrevocable trust, but can it be terminated during a person's lifetime?
So I'll give just a quick high level on what this is. This is what I would call a bit more of an advanced estate planning strategy. So there's something called a charitable remainder trust, or a CRT. There's also something called a charitable lead trust, or a CLT. And so what that basically refers to is it's kind of a combination type of trust that can benefit a charity and it can benefit people. And it's going to be at different points. So a charitable lead trust means generally the charity benefits up front in the gift. Charitable remainder means the charity benefits at the end of the term. And so it is an irrevocable trust. So once you put money in there, you've been able to write those rules, but those rules are going to stay in place. And so depending on what the circumstances are, generally speaking, you're not going to be able to terminate it if there's still assets in there during your lifetime, for example. But the rules are set up to where it automatically terminates at a different, like a further point out, whether it's the second to die of a couple or after a 20-year term or something like that. So there's a lot of different choices in there. But I would encourage someone, if they're considering options to terminate a CRT or a CLT, definitely talk to an attorney to see what your trust document says and what the options are for you.
Super. Got some questions about Roth IRAs. Number one, is it possible to switch from a regular IRA that I already have to a Roth? Can you switch midstream?
Yes, so I'll talk about a couple of different ways you can do that. So for example, let's say you've been making traditional IRA contributions as you've been working over time. At any point, you can switch to a Roth or back to a traditional. It's really more about how much income you have in the family and whether you qualify to do a Roth IRA. So contribution-wise, you don't have to do one or the other. You can switch anytime you want. And some years, depending on your income, you may be able to make a partial Roth contribution and a partial traditional contribution. So totally free to go either way as long as you meet the income limitations. Now, in terms of something called a Roth conversion, so I didn't get into this, although I love Roth conversions. They're a great strategy to do. So that's when you take money out of a traditional IRA, you intentionally incur that income and pay taxes on it, and then you put it into a Roth IRA. That's typically going to be best to do, say, after you've retired or you're in a year that has a low tax bracket, because then what happens, let's say, right after you retire and before you take Social Security, your overall income is very low. You could convert some money from the traditional to the Roth, and then you could pay taxes, say, at a 10% rate or a 12% rate, which is maybe lower than what you would be later on in your lifetime. And that way, this is what a lot of our clients do. They put money into that Roth, it's called a Roth conversion. And then when they pass away, their kids inherit a Roth, and that's more beneficial tax-wise generally than a traditional IRA. But I will tell people, if you're doing those Roth conversions, don't leave the Roth to a charity. Like, don't incur all this taxable income and then end up leaving that to a charity. Like, it would be better to leave your traditional IRA to a charity if that's what your ultimate intention is.
Got it. Got some questions about income. At what point of value of my estate is it a good idea to look at a trust? Is there like a rule of thumb that if I've got X amount value of my estate, then I should start thinking about using a trust?
I would say it's really more dependent on what the needs of your beneficiaries are. In terms of when to use a trust. So for example, if you have 2 grown children, everyone gets along, there's not any kind of legal situations that either one of them is involved with, and your estate is, I'm just going to make this up, $200,000, for example. You probably don't need to set up a trust. Again, consult an attorney, caveat. You probably would not need to set up a trust. Probably just a straight will would be fine, and each child gets half of your estate. Everyone moves on. But let's say, for example, one of your children struggles with addiction, which is a very common situation, and you don't necessarily want to leave that money outright to them. That could be an example of when you might want to use a trust. Or let's say your kids have their own kids, so they have minors that are in the situation. A lot of people will say, okay, my money would go directly to child A if they're still alive, but if they have predeceased me and I want that money to go to my grandchildren, then I want that to be in trust as long as they're minors. So I would say it's, generally speaking, the trust comes into play depending on what your beneficiaries' needs are, as opposed to a specific dollar amount to consider. That being said, of course, if you're potentially in some kind of estate taxability situation, you would definitely want to consider trust both during lifetime and at death. And
those types of wishes are things that you would outline within your will, correct? Mm-hmm. That's where that would be the document where you would say, I want this to happen and this to happen.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah. You can outline your wishes in your will directly. You can take care of pretty much anything you can think of. But as I said, if that money goes directly to that person as opposed to a trust, then that person doesn't have to abide by your wishes. It's their money legally, and they can do with it as they want.
Right. Speaking of those types of things, got a couple questions here. One was asking about setting up stock accounts for their grandchildren and making additions to that each year. Is that a good option for leaving a legacy for your grandkids specifically?
Yes, it definitely can be. So there's a special type of account called a Uniform Transfer to Minor account, or UTMA, which is, I don't know why everyone in the industry calls it that, but it's a custodial account. So what that means is you would go to a Schwab, Fidelity, Vanguard, you would open that up. There would be a custodian named. It could be you, it could be the child's parent, for example. You could put money into that, and then each year, that child or you could buy, some mutual funds, some stock, et cetera, and have that grow every year. The advantage of that is that it's simple, there's no legal documents required, and it's flexible. So for example, if the child is 16 and needs to buy a car, the parent, as the custodian in this case, would be able to take money out of the account and use it for that child's benefit for really any needs other than food, clothing, and shelter. So cars, computers, things like that. But it's not as tax advantageous. Okay, so you do have to pay. There's some breaks in there, but you do have to pay income tax on the interest and the gains in there that goes on the child's tax return in this case. And then also when the child achieves what's called the legal age of termination, which in Texas is age 21, they get that account outright and they can do whatever they want to with it, including quitting college and deciding to travel the world now that they have money in that account. So that's where the 529 could be a better option, because you can still put money in, it's still invested in the stock market, but it's tax-free. And then there's that flexibility in case that child decides not to go to college. You could then change it to a family member and use it for that family member. But the downside is you couldn't use it to buy a car, for example. It really would need to be used for qualified educational expenses.
Excellent. Got a question about annuities with long-term care riders. Is that a thing? And what are some of the benefits of having those types of annuities?
Mm-hmm. So this has been a new phenomenon in the last few years. So let me back up and give you a couple of definitions. So long-term care insurance, you can buy a policy, pay a premium each year, and then it pays if you have some of those activities of daily living that you can't do. Usually there's certain qualifications in there. And so it can kick in to pay for home health care. It can kick in to pay for part of your assisted or skilled nursing expenses. They're great policies, but they're expensive. And what we found is that they're getting more and more expensive nowadays and having to reduce benefits because costs of long-term care have gone up much higher than the overall rate of inflation. So then the new thing that we're seeing are these hybrid policies that are combining. I've generally seen like a whole life policy combined with long-term care insurance. They could certainly be doing this with annuities as well. But the idea is you put money into some kind of insurance policy, whether it's annuities or a whole life policy. And then depending on what happens, because not everyone gets long-term care expenses, that money would either be used to help pay for long-term care expenses if incurred, or if not incurred, that money would just go directly to your beneficiary. The ones with the life insurance policies, I have seen some ones that have been a little bit more flexible, which is nice because they can apply to a couple. And then that way, if one member of the couple incurs long-term care and the other one doesn't, it just provides that flexibility around like where your personal needs are. So I would recommend talking to a life insurance person who specializes in long-term care, and they would be able to educate you both on those hybrid policies, whether it's an annuity or a whole life policy.
Excellent. And while we're talking about healthcare, got a question about what are the requirements for a health savings account? That something that was kind of new to some folks.
Mm-hmm. So health savings accounts you can only open and contribute to them if you have what's called a high deductible healthcare plan. So first of all, Medicare does not count. So sorry, anyone who's 65 and older and is on Medicare, sorry, you're not able to open and contribute to a health savings account. But what the deal is like, say you have a child or a grandchild who's working, or you're working at a job where this is offered. You generally have to have a deductible for your healthcare plan that's higher than a certain threshold. So you may have two options in your healthcare plan. One is your standard, deductible, and then the high deductible is going to be higher. But then you generally pay a little bit lower premium for the policy, because now the insurance company doesn't have to kick in until at a little bit higher threshold. So you pay a little bit lower premium, and it gives you the option to contribute to a health savings account. And you can open that either through a lot of health insurance plans, like my company's with Humana, they have a health insurance account you can just invest in through them. There's also other providers out there that do it as well. But you can put money in there, and it has the industry likes to call it a triple tax advantage. So you get a break on the FICA taxes that you pay on your payroll when you make your deductions to it from your paycheck. And then you don't pay any dividends and capital gains as you hold it. And then as long as you use it for qualified medical expenses, you don't pay taxes on it either. So it's one of the rare things where you get a deduction going in and coming back out. And depending on whether you have an individual plan or a family plan, you can generally put in, I forget what the 2021 limits are, but roughly $3,200 for an individual or $6,400 for a family. And then what you can do is you can either leave it in there and let it grow over time, so you can invest it in mutual funds and stuff like that. And then when you do incur long-term care down the road, for example, you have this nice nest egg you can use. Or if you do need the money now to pay for medical expenses, you can always take money out and pay for medical expenses now if you want to. So it has a lot of flexibility in there, and they are fantastic savings vehicles.
So like if you know in a few years you're going to need knee surgery, start that account, start saving that money up, and then you've got that nest egg when that comes along and you need it.
Exactly. That's a great example.
Excellent. Speaking of taxes, if someone owes the IRS and their payments are paid directly from their IRA, is that taxable?
That's a good question. I have not heard of that particular situation. My assumption though is that it would be taxable, and the way you would tell is if in January of each year, if you get a 1099-R, so a 1099 is a tax form that shows taxable income, R stands for retirement. If you receive a 1099-R from your IRA and it has a taxable amount in there, that means yes, it is taxable. And so depending on how they may be garnishing for the payment, my guess is yes, it probably is.
Okay. All right. Another tax question. You had talked about bunching, and question is, if I double up on my property taxes, so I pay a January and a December for 2 separate years, do I still have that $10,000 cap?
Yeah, sadly you do. So that is a little frustrating when they put that new cap in there. But yes, it is total for the year. So you add up your property taxes and your sales taxes, and that cannot exceed $10,000 for deductibility purposes per year.
Okay. All right. So it's per year. So it would be 10,000 for January and 10,000 for December for a total of 20, or is it the 10,000 for this year of January through December?
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
All right. Got another question here. Is it complicated to will my home or my property to a charitable organization, and is that a good idea?
So it can be done, and just like any other asset, you can make a bequest in your will, whether it's real estate, whether it's an investment account or a bank account. So it's generally not too difficult. It would just be a matter of visiting with an estate planning attorney and making sure that your will reflects that. There's also various ways you can set up the deed of your house to have it automatically pass. I believe Virginia covered that on Tuesday a little bit. So that would be a great resource to listen to as well. In terms of whether it's a good idea or not, it's, I always hate the "it depends" answer, but it really depends. If that is something that fulfills your charitable desires and is something that's the best for you personally and for your family, then it's absolutely, a great way to pass along assets to a charity. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that the charity is going to incur some expenses in terms of they're going to have to turn around and sell that piece of property. They may keep it, but for the most part, the charity is going to need to incur some expenses to sell it, get it ready for market, and stuff like that. But especially in the Austin real estate market, the way things are going, I'm sure any charity would be thrilled to receive a gift of real estate. So yes, it definitely can be done.
Is it a good idea to put the home into a trust, to include it within a trust?
Mm-hmm. It can, especially if you're talking about these, we made the distinction between revocable and irrevocable trusts.
Yeah.
So a revocable trust or a living trust, a lot of times attorneys will say, yes, go ahead and put the house in the name of the trust, just to make sure, again, that all of your wishes are followed upon your death, because that trust, does let you write some rules about how things are treated. Also, if you have property in other states, the nice thing about putting a piece of property into a trust is that it avoids probate. So probate's not a huge deal in Texas, but it can be a real pain in other states, especially if you have to go to, your beneficiaries have to travel to other states, make an appearance in front of a judge, probate the will in all of these different states. So a trust can be a great thing, especially if you have property in other states.
Great. Got a question. If there is an ideal way to use an RMD when we really don't need the money.
Mm-hmm.
And can you remind us what an RMD is?
Sure. So that is a required minimum distribution from an IRA, a traditional IRA or pre-tax. I use those interchangeably. So, or a 401k. Most people end up rolling their 401ks to an IRA, but it's basically any type of retirement plan where you've been able to defer your taxes for all these years. So you made contributions while you were working, you've never had to pay taxes on it. Uncle Sam says, okay, I want my share of taxes. And so I want you to take the money out each year and I'm going to tax you on it. It used to be at age 70 and a half that you had to start it. It's now moved to age 72. And breaking news, they're talking about moving it to age 75, by the way. That's a new act that's out there as a potential. But in terms, if you don't need it and you don't really want that extra income on your tax return, those qualified charitable distributions, the QCDs, are a great option because you can just make that contribution directly to charity and it counts towards your RMD. Or if you don't mind taking the taxes on your tax return, you can convert that over to an IRA, a Roth IRA. Now, typically the government makes you take your full RMD before you can make a conversion, but that could be an option. Or maybe you just take the RMD and gift it to a loved one, maybe fund their Roth IRA contribution each year.
Excellent. And one last question. You mentioned that Richard P. Slaughter has some great resources on your website that people can go and read, and tells about different types of investments in that. But is there a book that you might recommend for folks who are wanting to look for charitable giving advice? They're kind of just exploring this. Is there a good book that someone might look up that would help start guiding them in that direction?
Mm-hmm. I don't know a book off the top of my head, but I will give you a couple of great resources on, say, donor advised funds. So for example, Schwab runs one of the largest donor advised funds out there, and they have a specific website called schwabcharitable.org. And that's a great resource just with a lot of general articles about how to give to charity. Also, Schwab and Fidelity have a lot of general articles up there about those qualified charitable distributions, so they'll go into more detail on those. The Austin Community Foundation that I mentioned earlier, they have a lot of notes about how to give to charities. And then also those, we talked a little bit about, say, like health savings accounts and stuff. There are some good resources out there where you can read about those through HSA Bank, for example. That's a provider of HSAs, but they have a lot of educational articles on there. But I don't know any books off the top of my head that specifically talk about charitable giving, but any kind of personal finance book will probably have at least one section in there about how to give wisely to charities.
Excellent. And that's a great place to start, is with those resources. We mentioned a couple times Virginia Sampson's session on Tuesday about legal and financial issues. You can go to YouTube and just search for Age of Central Texas. It'll bring up our channel, and you'll be able to watch her session there. And of course, as we mentioned, we've been recording all the sessions and posting them to YouTube. So at the end of our week, we're going to send you a concise email that's going to have links to every single one of those, along with links to the PDFs of the PowerPoints. So if you have something you want to go back and look at again, and we're going to resend you all of the resources. So watch your emails. We're going to send you all of that info. And speaking of resources, one thing that Steve over at Pflugerville Community Church was able to set up yesterday, if you have been coming to the Pflugerville Conference for a couple of years, I know that you got to see Lynn Shank a couple years ago talking about Medicare and Medicaid. Well, Lynn's going to come back in October, and we're going to do an in-person at the church. And it's going to be on October 14th. We're going to send all this information to you, but here's your save the date. October 14th, we're going to do an open enrollment whole session on Medicare, Medicaid, how to work with your pharmacy and Medicare Advantage, all those great things. Also, there's going to be some major changes coming down the pike for enrollment in 2023. And the Medicare enrollment rules are going to change for the first time in 50 years. And so Lynn's going to talk about that and give us all a heads up on that. So save the date, October 14th, and we'll send you more information on that. Darby, I want to thank you so much. This was an amazing amount of information, and it's an area that can be very complicated. And for those of us that don't have much of a background in it, it's kind of, we start exploring it a little bit and we suddenly get lost really quick. But you simplified a lot of very difficult things for us, and really appreciate you taking the time today away from your work to help educate us and help answer our questions. So thank you so much for doing this today. We really appreciate you.
Oh, absolutely. It was an honor. Thank you, Rob.
And we want to thank you at home for watching with us today. We hope that we were able to bring you some great information. Tomorrow, we are going to sum it all up, and we're going to have a session on how to look for your local resources and how to access those as you age. So join us tomorrow at 10 o'clock. And so for Age of Central Texas and for the Pflugerville Community Church, we thank you so much. Hope you have a great day, and we'll see you tomorrow morning. Bye-bye.